So I'm Mick Felton, as the screen says. I'm the publisher at Seren, and I want to welcome you to our second event celebrating 40 years of independent publishing at Seren. Seren began life as Poetry Wales Press, which was intended to provide a platform for writing and writers from Wales in English. Almost inevitably, one result of this has been 40 years of fascination with place, from Iolo Williams's Wild Places to memoirs like Roseanne Alexander's 10 Years on Skomer, Andrew McNeely's Childhood in Snowdonia, Robert Minhinnick's almost obsessive writing about the sand dunes around Porthcawl and Porthcawl itself, and fiction from authors like Christopher Meredith and Richard Evans, who bring to life the experience of living in Tredegar on the one hand and Treorchy on the other. We've published two long-running series about place. The first was Borderlines, a series of introductory biographies of writers, artists and composers who lived in or were inspired by the Welsh-English borders. These included volumes not by unfortunately, but on Dennis Potter, Bruce Chatwin, Mary Webb, John Cooper Powys, Eldar, Herbert Howells, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Ellis Peters, and artistic tourists like Eric Gill and David Jones at Capel Finn. The other series, of course, is the Real series, which started not as a series at all, but as Peter Finch's attempt to get to the heart of his native city, to discover what was typical about it, what was real Cardiff like. This mixture of memoir and anecdote, local history and walking the city was a great success. Jan Morris called it one of the very best books about a city I've ever read, and she had a bit of experience in that field. So it was obvious to Peter and I that Real could be a transferable feast, and other titles were commissioned. In Wales at first, but then spreading out across the UK. So 19 years on and 25 titles later, with 3 more in the pipeline, here we are. The Real series has been a significant part of Seren's publishing, and we thought it only right to celebrate it in our anniversary year. There's a panel of authors tonight, which shows the breadth of the series list, from Bloomsbury to Barnsley, from industrial Port Talbot to rural Welsh-speaking Gwynedd. Nicholas Murray, long-term resident of Bloomsbury and Mid-Wales, where I think he is now, is a novelist, poet, publisher at the Rack Press and biographer whose subjects include Chatwin, of Borderlines fame, Aldous Huxley, Kafka, Marvell, Victorian travellers and Great War poets. Lynn Rees, who's never really left Port Talbot, you can take the girl out of Port Talbot, etc., but who's rediscovering it afresh, is a poet, novelist and writer about food. Ian McMillan is a poet, journalist, playwright and broadcaster who presents Radio 3's The Verb. He's the poet in residence at Barnsley FC, so unlucky last season, Ian, and is popularly known as the Bard of Barnsley. If you're one of the very few people who doesn't follow Ian on Twitter, you should, because his posts are very entertaining. Rhys Muin is a former teacher who became a rock musician, record label owner, music publisher, writer, radio and TV presenter. He's a heritage advisor, a blue badge tour guide, a lecturer for the WEA, and an adult education lecturer at Bangor University. And he's still got time to write books. Rhys is the author of the forthcoming Real Gwynedd, available this Christmas, everyone. So we need to let these authors speak. I think I've said enough. So I'll hand over to poet, publisher and author Peter Finch, the author of the first Real book and series editor. Peter, you'll notice that I haven't used the G word. Or even the P word.
Okie doke. Thank you, Mick. Thank you enormously. The series has been a huge success and has grown to something that I didn't think it would grow to, going well outside Wales. The first, as you've heard, the first Real book was Real Cardiff 1, there it is, which came out in 2002. And the series has blossomed since then. So what are Real books? They're psychogeographies, they're alternative guidebooks, they're histories, rambles, journals, novellas of praise and promotion, collections of authorial observation, intelligent, deeply penetrating analyses of just how places tick, all of those things. But they're more too. When I was a bookseller, and I was a bookseller for nigh on 20 years through the 70s, end of the 70s, right through the 80s and into the 90s, we had a local interest, a Welsh interest section, which was always full of people standing, browsing. And people would approach me and offer me books that they wanted me to sell in the shop. And these were often rough and ready productions. They'd be badly put together. They'd have no titles on their spines. They would fail to say who the author was. They'd offer no bookseller's discount whatsoever, have a cover done by the local art teacher, and were often shaggily written. But they sold and they sold and they sold. And I thought, I could do this. Why not try and get a real book done? And somehow or other, that and some of the other history of all of this, which I'm not going to repeat tonight, bowled together and formed the Real series. And as we've seen, it's moved from beyond books about conurbations in Wales to books about larger areas in Wales to books about cities and places elsewhere, right across, well, I was going to say the globe, Britain so far anyway. I keep suggesting to Mick that that offer we've had for Real Los Angeles should be taken up. And I say this because as series editor, I have to go to these places on expenses and write about them by way of the introduction. So that's enough from me telling you what the series was, is, how it came about. I think I'd like to hear from our four authors tonight, a little bit from each author about how they approached writing their book or read a section from it. And we're going to do this in the order that the books came out. The first departure from the notion of doing everything inside Wales was to try and find authors who did things about parts of London. Nick Murray came out with the terrific idea of doing Bloomsbury for us. So Nick, tell us a little bit about that.
Okay, well, I've lived the past 35 years here in the Renfrewshire Hills. I'm 1,000 feet above sea level at the moment. But I also had, for a chunk of that time, a tiny little studio flat right in the heart of Bloomsbury, a stone's throw from the British Museum. And this gave me, I think, a bit of a perspective, that a little bit of distance, perhaps. I was both there and had somewhere else to, as it were, judge it against. This book was written by shoe leather. I walked every inch of that patch, and I appreciate it's easier to do that if you're writing about a district rather than a whole city or a town. And I talked to people and I wandered the streets. So I'm going to read a little bit here where I start in Great James Street. Great James Street is probably the most beautiful street architecturally in Bloomsbury. Nicholas Pevsner called it a gem. 18th century houses, beautiful fan vaulted glass over the doors and so on. And it conforms with what many people think Bloomsbury is like. And here we go. Once again, I look up and down the street, speculating as to what the interiors are like. Today, thanks to Cardiff-born John Davies, managing partner at Patterson and Brewer Solicitors at number 30, I'm invited inside to see for myself. He makes the obvious point that Georgian houses are not necessarily the best kind of design for modern office life, but Patterson and Brewer have carefully preserved the beautiful wooden banisters, some semicircular oak doors, and a wonderful device used for summoning servants from the lower depths of the house. A little peg is taken out of a hollow wooden tube in the corner of John Davies' secretary's office and blown like a whistle, the sound traveling down the tube. Internal email has no doubt replaced it today, but it is yet another reminder of how the Bloomsbury house expressed in its construction social hierarchies that must once have seemed permanent. I have always seen it as a village, says John Davies, of his Petit Quartier of Great James Street, Rugby Street, and Lamb's Conduit Street, where he has worked for 35 years. The firm used to get its milk delivered from Glyn and Margaret Davies, a Welsh-speaking couple in striped aprons, now retired, who ran a dairy called French's Dairy. Their parents founded the business, but the premises is now a designer jewelry shop with several outlets operating under the French's Diary label. That kind of transformation is very Bloomsbury. The old artisanal memory preserved in designer outlets that no common or garden dairyman could afford to shop in. The roll call of deceased trades in and around Lamb's Conduit Street includes chandlers, boot repairers, sign writers, patent medicine makers, and oil and color men. There was a Greek Cypriot dry cleaners next door to French's, and that premises is now a swanky interior designer called the English House, which has done work for Prince Charles. John Davies recalls butchers, bakers, fishmongers, ordinary cafes, most of which have vanished. Following his direction, I turn left into Rugby Street, whose name reminds us that Rugby School still continues to own land here. And I can see on the opposite side, number 18, where Ted Hughes rented an apartment in the 1950s. On March the 23rd, 1956, he spent his first night here with Sylvia Plath before she left for Paris the next day, an event commemorated by his poem 18 Rugby Street in the collection Birthday Letters. The poem refers to the Victorian torpor and squalor of number 18, which was in multiple occupation, and on each of the 4 floors, the tenants bed-hopped in a laboratory of amours. A Belgian girl in the ground floor flat entertained a second-hand car dealer and stored his exhaust silencers and car parts. Hughes sat alone in his flat, writing at an old joiner's bench that stood in as desk and table. And it was here that he and Plath spent their wedding night in the single bed. Okay.
Let me ask you, Nick, how in your encyclopedic book about Bloomsbury, let's call it that, did you manage to avoid the domination of Virginia Woolf and her friends, the whole of the Bloomsbury ghosts, the literary ghosts of Bloomsbury?
Well, in a very practical and concrete way, I made sure that I discussed the Bloomsbury group right at the end of the book. I pushed them to the end of the book so that I could talk about other things. Because you have to think of Bloomsbury as, the very word does trigger those associations, Virginia Woolf, Lytton Strachey, etc. But it's also, for example, the area around Cromius Street has a very substantial Bengali community. The London Borough of Camden has the biggest Bengali community in Britain, I think. And in Marchmont Street, this is illustrated beautifully by the Bloomsbury Halal butchers and grocery shop, which has a blue plaque fastened to its front, which says that William Empson lived there and wrote 7 types of ambiguity in that spot. So that's a kind of blend, typical Bloomsbury blend, you know, of there are huge council estates that people don't realize. So there's quite an interesting social mix. It's not all posh people like Lytton Strachey looking down their noses at the common folk. It's a very diverse and mixed and quite an interesting place.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you. Let's switch now to somewhere that's equally as up and down simultaneously. One of the great places in Wales, Lynn Rees, food writer, and Port Talbot.
Right, yes, real Port Talbot. I liked what Nicola said about walking everywhere, because that's something I loved about writing and researching real Port Talbot, going everywhere on foot. But the thing about the actual writing that I loved the most was how I could write in different genres. So I could do historical research, I could do some journalistic commentary, then I could write memoir and also some poetry. And blending all those things together actually made more of the individual parts and created something much, much, much richer. So the piece I'm going to read is about Sandfields Estate, which was the big estate built mostly in the 50s for the big influx of workers to Port Talbot with the steelworks. And I was born and grew up there. You don't hear a lot of Welsh spoken around the estate, though you see it more these days. As part of their regeneration work, the local authority have regreened corners of streets and roundabouts and replaced the English-only street signs with bilingual ones. Heol and Roddfa sit below street and avenue. My parents came from Welsh-speaking families, so the language has always been part of my life. But the outdated belief that kids learning 2 languages would be slower, combined with the only Welsh language school in the 1960s being miles away at Pontrhydyfen, persuaded them to bring up their 3 children to speak English. There was a smattering of Welsh at my Tir Morfa infant school. Ble mae Teddy? Dyma Teddy. Ble mae Dolly? Dyma Dolly. They were the components of my first Welsh lessons in the temporary classrooms. Tir Morfa was one of 5 primary schools built on the estate, a sign of the baby boom of the 50s, with the infants and juniors connected by a shared dining hall. The 2 halves still share it, but since 1987, the infants is now Rosafon, the only Welsh medium school in Port Talbot for 3 to 11-year-olds. One of my reasons for visiting was to reacquaint myself with a huge mural in the assembly hall, 4 panels, each measuring about 12 feet by 12 feet, by Port Talbot-born artist Andrew Vicari. Vicari, whose parents moved to South Wales from Italy in the 1930s, was born in 1938 in Aberavon, in a flat above a shop that sold, of all things, paint. The family moved to Neath shortly afterwards. He attended Neath Grammar School for Boys and the Swansea School of Art. At the Slade in London, he was mentored by Francis Bacon and brushed canvases with other luminary artists of the era, including Lucian Freud and Craigie Aitchison. He moved to Monaco in 1975, following his appointment a year earlier as official artist to the Saudi Arabian king and government, an event that propelled him to international acclaim and astonishing wealth. I don't expect him to get in touch with me personally when I contact him via his website, but he does, and he happens to be in London. So why don't I come up to his club for tea? His club is the East India Club in St. James's Square behind Piccadilly. The address I have is number 16, but neither its name nor its number are of much use, as the building is magnificently anonymous, half of which I feel while I wait for him in the teak-panelled, chandeliered reception. So I'm very pleased when he appears, and he's as far from intimidating as imaginable. Not very tall, a little rotund and quietly spoken, but still with a trace of his Welsh accent that gets stronger the longer we talk. When I show him a photocopy of one of the Tir Morfa School panels, he seems genuinely moved at seeing his work from over 50 years ago. Oh, look at them, he says. These make me feel I must be a good painter. Vicari worked in situ, in oils, over gessoed wooden panels, and directly from the faces of teachers and children who posed for him, standing on a plank as each panel grew in size and neared completion. Why don't you come back to Wales and live, I ask him. I'd feel too comfortable, he says, too much at home. There'd be no tension to paint. The mural is a product of its era, stylized lips and eyes, strong outlines, and perhaps more of a social statement and a nostalgia trip for me than a landmark of art history. It takes me back to a time of home-knitted jumpers, when the toys children carried didn't require a power source. The children feel unfamiliar to me, but the faces of the women are the remembered mothers of my childhood, Mammy, Auntie Ruth, Auntie Phil, Auntie Beryl. They were the soapsuds and steam of a Monday's laundry, the warnings of being in trouble when our fathers got home, letting us stay up late on Fridays for bonanza. Women their daughters took for granted until they feared they might lose them. Welcome hug. Each time I come home, my mother is smaller. Welcome hug. Each time I come home, my mother is smaller.
Brilliant, Lynn, thank you. Tell me, when you were researching Real Port Talbot, what surprised you about the place that you already knew?
Ordinary people that I met and learnt about who'd been part of the town's social history made a big impact on me. But there was one place in Port Talbot that I was completely unfamiliar with, and that was Morva Beach. And that's the stretch of coastline that fronts the Tata Steelworks. And it's a magnet for surfers and walkers and dog walkers and runners. It's only accessible by footpath from Margam or from Kenfig. But it's got such a diverse history. I mean, it's an invisible history because it is just the coastline now, and the steelworks took over all the land behind it. But there were Roman and Bronze Age relics found on the beach. There were centuries of shipwrecks. There's a medieval grange buried in the sand, just a little while in from the shore. The beach itself was used for preparations for the D-Day landings during World War II. And it's been used as a film location over and over again. But the story about it that really grabbed me, and I ended up writing much more about it, was the story of Morva Colliery. And that was behind the huge sand dunes, some of the biggest in Europe, that were flattened when the steelworks was put up in the late 1940s. And it's such a story of heartbreak and courage. And it's just intrinsic to the history of coal mining in Wales. And that was the place that really did have a strong effect on me, and still does when I go there now.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Those of you who are interested in tracking Port Talbot, you will find there's a reprint coming up, or maybe it's out already, of Real Port Talbot with some updates in it. So that's worth something out. So let's move from the coast, the Welsh coast, Welsh working class coast, to somewhere inland and a bit north, but possibly just as working class. And that would be Barnsley, from Ian Macmillan, who as a poet is somebody that I've had dealings with through many decades. Ian.
Well, when I was asked to write this book, I was nervous because I'd just finished another book that was a kind of semi-autobiographical thing that was about me and Yorkshire. And I tell you what, that book, writing that other book, nearly killed me. I thought I never want to write another book again in my life. Then Peter contacted me and said, "Do you fancy writing a book about Barnsley?" And I thought, well, what, a book, an actual book with all these words in? And he said, yes. And I said, well, I'll think about it. And then he sent me some of the real books. And I thought, actually, they can be a number of shorter pieces joined together. And I thought, that's what I can do. I can write shorter pieces and knit them together. And that's what I did. And I was thinking about a thing that Andy Croft from Smokestack Books said, when he said, you'll go to a festival and they go, "We've got real beer," and they all cheer. And they go, "We got real cheese," they all cheer. Then they say, "We got local cheese," and they cheer. And they go, "We got local beer," and they cheer. Then they go, "We got local writers," and they go, "Oh, local writers." And I wanted to celebrate that localness in this book, because where I'm sitting is about 200 yards from where I was born, just over there. So I wandered around Barnsley with my mate Ian, the artist. He was my chauffeur and photographer, and we drove about. And after a bit, you thought, blimey, I've been living here at the time for 61 years, 65 years now. And there's so many bits I haven't been to. I was learning so much all the time. There's a village called Pilly, where Harry Worth was born. I'd never been to Pilly. I went to Pilly. There's a village called Jump. Is this bus going to jump? Yes, well, hold it down because I'm getting on, as they all say in Barnsley. I'd never been to Jump. It turned out that Barnsley was quite a wide-ranging thing. And I even said, I've lived in Barnsley all my life. That's not true. I've lived in Darfield all my life. I've been to Barnsley a few times, but Darfield is only 3 miles from Barnsley. So in the end, I found all these things that I wasn't expecting to find. It was about that thing that I've always been keen on, the universal in the local. So finding all these things. So I'll read a little bit about where my mother came from, the next village, which is called Great Houghton, or Great Houghton, as we say around here. And my dad was a Scottish sailor, and him and my mother met as pen pals in the war. And they got married on a 48-hour pass. My dad was from Scotland, my mum from Great Houghton. So this is me just writing about Great Houghton with great love and delight. When you've lived somewhere all your life, certain places that you've always known are engraved on your mind as places of romantic meeting, of historical importance, of national and global significance, even if viewed from the outside, they're small ex-pit villages in a former coalfield. For me, Gretoten is one of these places. My mother came from there, so it's literally the motherlode. It's Proust's Madeline, and it's Seamus Heaney's Omphalos. So please forgive me if my writing about Gretoten has a more than usually rosy hue and is heavy with adjectives and adverbs and a kind of faux poetry. There are 3 settlements under consideration here: Gretoten, Little Oten, and Middlecliff, each fitting inside the other like a series of Russian dolls with pit helmets on. I begin at the nearest one of these to Darfield, Middlecliff, which I get to by walking from Darfield down the winding Fitzwilliam Road, known locally as Coalpit Lane. My dad had 2 allotments down Coalpit Lane because he always thought that one wasn't enough, although he was a middle-aged man and I was a grumpy teenager who would rather dig Captain Beefheart than dig soil. I've got to say that all the way through this book, I tried to put gags in, ridiculous gags about Captain Beefheart and a bit about the 3 villages being, and I was always trying to show off in the prose, which I know you shouldn't do, but I thought if it's about the place I live, then I'm allowed to show off a little bit. Let's read a little bit more. When I was a younger man, a rumour swept the village that the drummer from Def Leppard was going to live there because he wanted somewhere to land his helicopter. Maybe all villagers are awash with this kind of rumour from time to time. Maybe they're the equivalent of those Queen Anne Sleptia tales that pop up everywhere as they do in Gretoten. Perhaps we all need rock or real royalty to give our humble streets the mark of approval, to give our lives a kind of vicarious lustre. We never found out if Def Leppard fella actually moved to Darfield. I'll read just one more bit, which is Peter encouraged me to put poems in the book. And Lynn, as you said, it's just great to be able to write in all these different forms. So I thought, right, I'll put some poems in. And I'm very interested in the way they talk round here. People locally refer to Barnsley as Tarn, like they might call Newcastle Toon. We call Barnsley Tarn. And there's a kind of deep Tarn dialect that's almost unfathomable, but it's kind of beautiful. So I wrote a calendar, a deep Tarn calendar. And here's July and August. And if you can't fathom the words, just listen to the kind of mouth music of it, I would recommend. Got some shorts and this look, just look at this bugger that ain't like a full moon, else a flat snowball, else a coin, a pound coin, painted with emulsion, white flat cap. That tells that it's summer, no, tells that it's summer like one of these. Deep time calendar, August. Right, stand there. Dear. Just to the left a bit, that's right, dear. Look up at sky. Can I see it? A hint? No, more than a hint, an autumn. Same as a crinkling right edge at sky, a loss of clarity. A note from Leap that says it's not allowed to play art because it's delicate. So there you go.
Ian, tell me,
Yes.
when you were putting this book together,
were
you tempted to make any of it up?
Yes, I was. I certainly was. Because you think, well, years ago, I wrote a Yorkshire dictionary. And I said to the publisher, can I make some words up? They said, yes. And I thought, that's great. Because now what you do is, people say, what do you want to know about Barnsley? Oh, get down your Macmillan from the shelf. And so there is, to be honest with you, I can't remember which bit it is, but there is at least one bit in here that's made up. But the other authors will know that as soon as your book comes out, within the moment of it being published, letters will arrive through the letterbox, written in green ink, in capital letters, from people saying, you've got that absolutely and completely wrong. And I thought, well, if that's going to happen, then let's just celebrate it. Let's just celebrate the fact that, as you said, it's psychogeography, and it's also a kind of, I don't know, metafiction, isn't it? When you write about somewhere, as soon as you write about it, it becomes a kind of metafiction. You know, I love Lamb's Conduit Street, for example, Nicholas, but then the way you've written about it, given it it's those layers of history, then it becomes a kind of metafiction in my head, you know, what Lamb's Conduit Street is.
Spot on. Yeah, excellent. Let's move from the sublime to the ridiculous, as it were, from the very local, which is what we'll call Barnsley at the moment, to somewhere that's much bigger, and that's to go to Rhysmwyn to tell us about Gwynedd.
Yeah, my starting point was Gwynedd is familiar. I know Gwynedd well. And when the invitation arrived to write the real Gwynedd, I'm not sure why, I decided that initial chapter, you know, the sort of demo chapter to see if we were going to be commissioned, I went to Tre Madog, near Porthmadog. And Tre Madog is a rare thing in Gwynedd. It's a planned town. It was designed by William Maddox, the MP, the same person who built the Cobb across the estuary, Glaslyn estuary. And I stood in the square, huge square, too large a square really compared to anything else in Gwynedd, with my notebook. And I just thought, right, Rhys, what am I going to write? And then the second great idea was, I know, let's find a cafe, get a fried egg sandwich and a cup of tea, start there. And of course, in Tre Madog, being a planned town, not quite posh, but it doesn't have a greasy cafe. It's not like downtown Cardiff. So I was deprived of this concept of writing in a cafe. And I stood in the square and I thought, right, well, I'm going to start somewhere. And through the corner of my eye, I saw a very battered town notice board. So I wandered over and looked at this town notice board, barely legible, it was well weathered. And I started to look at the various, it was one of those, all these interesting facts about Tre Madog. And at the bottom, there was a piece about Shelley, the poet. And it is true that Shelley spent a couple of years at Tre Madog, all sorts of stories. But the final line on this notice board, information board, it was a question really posed. And the question was the novel, Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein, conceived in Tre Madog? And I just thought, what? Frankenstein conceived in Tre Madog? Surely not. And it was just so funny. And I phoned up Angharad Price, who lectures in Bangor University, and I said, Angharad, Shelley and Mary, they didn't know each other, did they, when he was at Tre Madog? And my understanding is they hadn't met. So this idea of Frankenstein being conceived in Tre Madog, pardon my Welsh here now or my Cymraeg, is total bollocks, complete utter bollocks. And it was that one ridiculous statement on the information board that sparked that chapter, which became the first chapter written. So I went on a search for the Gothic, which I obviously knew I was never going to find, and followed myself around Tre Madog. And that was it, really, finding what you'd call the author's voice, isn't it? Just trying to find from this familiar area and a familiar narrative, trying to find this quirkiness that Peter mentioned in the brief. And that took me to sit in the garden of Gorffwysfa, which was the birthplace of T.E. Lawrence. And when I take people to see T.E. Lawrence's birthplace now, I say Peter O'Toole, and they remember Lawrence of Arabia and the film, and they get it. So that's true in Tre Madog. T.E. Lawrence was there for about a year. And what's really interesting is the locals have no affinity. You never hear people proud of the fact that Lawrence of Arabia was born in Tre Madog. And as kids, of course, we remember that film with Peter O'Toole. So it was finding those things similar to the other authors in a way. You get off the beaten track, sit underneath an apple tree and get that inspiration. And the second story I've got was on Llŷn, the Llŷn Peninsula. There are lots of little villages, Sarn Milldain, Botwnog. People are familiar with Abersoch. And I thought, right, what am I going to write about these villages? And I'd seen a documentary recently. Hugh Stevens, the Radio 1 DJ, Radio Cymru DJ, had produced a film, a road trip, musical road trip around Wales. And he'd met up with Iwan, who sings with a band called Cowboys Rhos Botwnog, and they come from Botwnog on Llyn. And Iwan had mentioned in this film, it was just a flippant comment, that the River Soch at its source near Carnfadryn, you can jump across it. And he was talking about something like the river inspiring his songs. And I thought, that's brilliant, isn't it? I can follow the river and see if I can jump across it. And that becomes another chapter. So it was always trying to find from the familiar these little things that would make you smile, make you explore. There's definitely an element of psychogeography in there. There's playing with, you know, how you look at a place, isn't it? That way of reevaluating the familiar. Once those things became apparent, it became quite easy. And I'll finish then. I'm not going to read because it's unpublished. The best story of all, there's an extremely small village near Dinas Mawddwy called Llan y Mawddwy. It's up towards Bwlch Groes that takes you over to Bala. In English, you'd call it at best a hamlet. You know, it's a church and a couple of houses. And there's another village notice board or information board. And I couldn't believe it when I read it. I just thought, this is too good to be true. They mentioned 2 stories of giants, 2 different giants. And I just sat there thinking, Llan y Mawddwy, you've got about 3 houses and a church and 2 giants. And there you go then, you're off and away, and you can write then about these places once you find. So that was it really, following the unknown within a familiar landscape. That was the big challenge, to find something to write that is not obvious.
Excellent, Rhys. Thank you. Thank you very much. Those of you who are interested, you'll be able to buy Real Gwynedd before Christmas. You can see the link. It's already come up on the side there somewhere. If you'd like to put in an order now, it's bound to be a bestseller. Let me ask our 4 writers in general, if they could say something about the balance between the amount of getting out on the road with your notebook, taking notes in the middle of the rain so the pad gets soggy, that kind of research, versus the stuff you do by reading books, looking at the internet and sitting in the room at the top of your house. Let me pitch that at Rhys first of all, since he's nearest to this process than anyone else.
I would say, certainly with Real Gwynedd, it was the higher 90% outdoors, walking or driving or whatever. Obviously, you check your facts online, but most of the research was on the ground, out and about.
Right. That's, yeah. Okay. Would that be the same for you, Lynn?
Yeah. What I tended to do was spend 2 weeks in the town in a particular area and just walk everywhere, even places where I wasn't supposed to walk, which reminds me of the walk I did with you, Peter, when you got us arrested by Tata security, because we were trying to walk through the works towards the docks. My last words before the security van with the personnel screeched in front of us were, I don't think we can get through this way. But yeah, so I spent 2 weeks just walking everywhere and note taking. And actually I used for the first time ever a voice recorder. So I could just talk my impressions into this little thing and then later, take down the notes from it. But 2 weeks on the ground and then 6 weeks in front of a desk. And what I tried to do as well was not to go out walking with an idea of what I was going to write about. So I wanted the landscape, whether it was urban or rural, to dictate to me, to let me discover and then do the research afterwards.
Yeah, yeah. Ian, you've already told us, haven't you, that you were driven around most of Barnsley for your research, so you didn't do the walking, but you must have done some. And did you?
Yeah, we did. He would drop me off and I'd go walking about. He was just there really he was there to take photographs and also to be a kind of, to be a straight man in a way, you know. So I was saying stuff and he was responding to it. So I always have to have a kind of straight man with me. I had a vision before I started writing it of me sitting in some kind of padded chair, wearing perhaps a corduroy suit and doing that thing called research, which I've never ever done, and kind of fancied doing it, research, and perhaps every so often leaning over to a book and getting it out. But as both the other authors said, as Rhys and Lynn have said, most of it is done out and about, and people tell you things, you notice things, notice boards, you pop into a library, you talk to people on the street, and then you come back and you check a few facts. But mostly the research was simply my mate Ian driving me about, me walking about and talking to people and them telling us stories, I guess.
Yeah. But you, Nick, you would have had a different approach to that?
No, I think, as I said earlier, because I was a relatively smaller patch, it was very easy to walk it, beat the bounds, and I walked every single inch of it, but that wasn't as formidable a task as it might sound. But I also did a lot of research. Mind you, there's an awful lot available. I was writing about a very well-known part of London. Everyone's read all the funny stories about Lytton Strachey, etc. But I did feel that, you know, without pounding the pavement, I don't think you get a sense of a place. Rhys, just think about Mary Shelley. Apparently she wrote Frankenstein in Byron's house on the shores of Lake Geneva. They had a kind of contest to see who would write a ghost thing. And when I was last in Geneva, I took a stroll down to see Byron's house. Unfortunately, you can't get in. It's not open to the public. But why did I do that? Because I think, you know, you like get however much you know from books, you want to see the real place, don't you?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Did any of you get difficulty or overawed by this psychogeography, the term psychogeography, and the fact that suddenly you'd signed a contract to write a book that was something to do with psychogeography? How did you tackle that? Let me ask Rhys directly, since he's again nearer it than anybody else.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. My background really is punk rock. That's where I got politicized and interested. And I think what that does give you is this sort of healthy approach that I don't always claim to be a psychogeographer, wouldn't always claim to know what it is, but I think I quite often do it. And my politics, if you like, I go with Groucho Marx. I wouldn't join a club that would have me as a member. And we've always seen that with the Welsh context, you know, with if you dabble with ideas like anarchy, you know, that was on the periphery of the punk thing, you'd quite often get to a point where English anarchists couldn't understand the Welsh perspective. So I've always maintained this view, Peter, that you just remain independent. And I don't really care if it's psychogeography or not, if it's punk rock or not, if it's particularly Welsh or not, because those will always be other people's definitions. And I think what's really healthy is when, you know, especially with boundaries, because I'm originally from Montgomeryshire, right on the English border, is this idea of crossing borders, no borders, getting rid of your passports. It's much more interesting than being defined. You know, I tend to reject the definitions, even if some of those disciplines are applied, if that makes any sense.
Some of these things are more prone to a psychogeographic interpretation. I mean, for example, if you wanted to do it in some sort of pure way, you'd have a section of the book about walking down roads that begin with the letter R. Never mind about where they were geographically, or, as I've tried and failed, walking around the roads of the district in alphabetical order. That didn't get me anywhere. Nick, how did you manage?
Well, I managed largely by trying to avoid using the words. But one person who impressed me a great deal was Arthur Machen, good Welsh writer, who wrote this wonderful book called The London Adventure or the Art of Wandering. So psychogeography's been around, and that was 1924. The psychogeography's been around a long time. And of course, the great master of it is Ian Sinclair, who wrote about London, not a lot about Bloomsbury, mostly East London. So I just thought to myself, I suppose I was working to a slightly more old-fashioned concept. If we can slip into Latin here, genius loci, the spirit of place. I mean, I think that's something that everybody can get their minds around, whereas psychogeography might be a slightly frightening term for some people.
Well, it is indeed. Ian, what did you think?
As soon as you said psychogeography, I felt liberated, because I thought at least that means I haven't got to write some kind of hyper realist directory of the place. If it's psychogeographical, then I can be in it quite a lot, which was good. Then I fancied the idea, like you said, of going down alphabetical streets. I was going to do a thing where I followed a dog. I was going to try and follow a dog as far as I could all the way around Barnsley, but that didn't quite work. But that idea of psychogeography being something that can lead you through time and space and history at the same time, in the same layers as you're walking along. So psychogeography has always been a great word for me in that way, because it means you can write about somewhere in a different kind of way, I reckon.
Yeah. Lee? How did it work?
First of all, I had to look it up to make sure that I knew what I should be doing after I'd signed the contract. But I really liked the subjectivity of the idea that I could walk around, let places affect me. And it was more about writing what I needed to write rather than what I should write if you were doing your usual guide to a particular town or a particular place. So that's what I really enjoyed. And I think also, this doesn't sound overly dramatic, writing the book has actually made me a braver writer as well as a braver person. Because I'm not naturally gregarious, but I found that I was pushing myself to go to places that I wouldn't have normally gone, which reminds me of what I just read in your book, Walking Cardiff, Peter, where you said that if psychogeography is anything, it makes you visit places that you wouldn't have normally visited. And I did push myself to go to places that might have been locked or closed, or you had to push through brambles or cross a bog or speak to people that I normally wouldn't have spoken to. And I just really enjoyed that and felt, as I said, I became a braver writer as well as a braver person in general.
Of course, this idea of visiting places that you wouldn't otherwise visit, I drew that from the Situationists who ran in Paris. They ran adventures to boring places. So they'd have a day trip to somewhere that was unknown and totally boring. And they weren't all that successful. This bunch of people would turn up in a bus and they'd get out, and something psychogeographic was supposed to happen, and it never did. Now let's take in a couple of questions that the audience have been pitching here. Patrick McGuinness, when he launched Real Oxford recently, he talked about passing buildings, for example, that he'd seen and he'd looked at many times, but he'd never noticed. And now here he was required to write a book, so he had to use new eyes. Is this something that's happened to anybody else?
Definitely for me, in Port Talbot's main high streets, Station Road, the lower level tended to be your, ubiquitous shops with neon signs. But when you look up above that, that's when the 19th century history of the town reveals itself in the architecture. And that was fascinating, writing about Station Road.
Yeah. Now here's something that is specific. Somebody's asking here, asking Nick, is there anything that, wait a minute, did any streets surprise you, given the relatively small size of Bloomsbury? Was there anything that you suddenly discovered, that you suddenly found yourself somewhere that you had not been before?
That's a very good question. But I don't think, I did go down some small back streets, and there's a lot of Mews streets in Bloomsbury, which are very, very fascinating. Let me think. It'd be hard to say whether I made any discoveries of that kind. I'm just trying to think.
Really, I suppose the question means, were you able, before you set out to write this book, able to, as it were, draw a complete map of Bloomsbury, and you knew the whole thing, you had it all in your head? Or how much discovery did you have to generate for yourself?
Yes. Oh yes. I mean, the walking was a kind of spur. So you would walk around and come back and think, I want to find out more about that particular street. It may be something as obvious as seeing a blue plaque and saying, I want to know more about that person. Or sometimes you want to know. I'm very particularly fascinated by derelict or ex-industrial places, you know, sort of jam factories and things like that. There aren't very many of those in Bloomsbury, but there are one or two old engineering works and things like that that are now having trendier uses. And so you go back to your research to try and find out more about what you've just seen. So in that sense, the walking is the preliminary trigger for doing some more mugging up.
So who amongst the four of you relishes being able to write about decrepit, broken down places? Or do you like to make your discoveries of somewhere that's been improved and somewhere that has a history that shines out of it? I mean, I thought, for example, I was in Rumney yesterday and got access to a scrapyard which dealt in broken down JCBs. So there was mile after mile of huge heaps of broken down earth moving equipment and other metalwork, all sprayed out across the top of a place that was formerly an early Welsh ironworks. And I think the relationship between those two discoveries in the same place I found terrific. But that was the wreckage that excited me, rather than the finer points of its construction. I
do like the fact that when you're walking around a place like Barnsley, because it's post-industrial, you will come across places that were once something else and have fallen to disrepair next to somewhere that's brand new, where they're trying to redevelop it. And that's the exciting thing. It's like you walk past a rotten tooth and a false tooth and a new tooth somehow on the same street. And that's always exciting when there are layers of history in a post-industrial place like this, I think.
Yeah.
I would say maybe what I see from the real series, and this is interesting, Peter, because I remember right at the beginning you said you're not writing a guidebook, but they're almost like guidebooks to opening up your eyes to seeing what you don't normally see. And I think if you forget the idea about guidebooks, that they're signposts, you know, it's a mechanism that you open up your eyes to see what's there. And then you find the new discoveries. So I don't think it matters so much whether they're new or old buildings. The landscape changes all the time, doesn't it? But that ability, one of the things that I played with was this idea, certainly in a place like Snowdonia, if you go walking, you've got terrific scenery and usually great company. So you go walking with somebody and you chat away and you look at the views, and then you miss out what's under your feet. And that will be, as Lynn mentioned, some of the archaeological sites. You walk over them without realizing. So I'm probably looking at it as a way of having a broader vision, that you're not missing these things, that you educate your eyes to see. It's there, but the majority of people walk past every day, not see it.
Let me ask the two. We got at least two poets here. Do poets approach the writing of these books differently, do you think, than novelists or journalists?
Oh, gosh, I don't know. I've done a novel and poetry. So what I did find with Real Talbot is that I was very attracted by character. So writing about people and putting them in context of the maybe social history or industrial history of the town. And that's probably a novelistic technique, to focus on character to tell a story.
Yeah. Anybody else? Ian?
I think for me, I was very much trying to give a range of images, which is probably a poet's way out. You know, I wasn't thinking of a plot. I wasn't thinking of characters. I wasn't particularly thinking of information, if you like. But what I always liked to think was, can I find an image or a couple of words or a phrase or an illuminated line that might encapsulate this place, not just for me, but for everybody else. And that links in with the psychogeography, I guess. You're trying to make this very ordinary town into some kind of mystical site, I reckon. That's the job of these real series, is to say, look, come to this place, have a look. It's a magical, you know. That Bloomsbury book, Nicholas, it's fantastic. And I love Bloomsbury, but it makes Bloomsbury, for me, a place of magic. It really does, you know. And is it? I want to ask a question to everybody. Do you think it's easier to do a smaller place like Bloomsbury or a massive place like a whole county? Because it wouldn't be interesting to go on the real series of just doing a street, you know, maybe a block of flats. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, it's been done, hasn't it? I mean, people like Gillian Tyndall, who wrote that book, The Fields Beneath. You know,
Yes,
and one of the most interesting things, historical discoveries I made about Bloomsbury was the fact that until about 1800, if you stood in where Russell Square is now and looked north, all you would see was fields running up to the hills of Hampstead and Highgate, and the people were droving cattle in there and so on. It was amazing. So it was only really started to be built up after about 1800. And I'm fascinated by that idea that this was once just, a small, well, it just simply was open country, and that's the centre of London.
Good question, because I'd read Real Powys, Mike Parker, and I think he probably had the same on that very question. Gwynedd is vast. It's vast. So you end up with what you leave out as much as what you can get in. So obviously a tighter focus would give you another narrative, wouldn't it? Another set of images. So I'll be honest, I thought Gwynedd, it's so vast. It was quite challenging just to find, you know, what to put in and what to leave out, really.
We had this with Pembrokeshire when we had two authors, one to write the north, one to write the south. And what did they do? They both fought over the middle. I'm writing about this bit. No, you're not. I am. And on that note, can I thank all four of you for contributing to the series with such terrific books, recommend them to the audience, and pass back to Mick Felton. Mick, of course, as most people don't know, is the man who compiles the indexes, the indices to these books, and the man who goes through the fine detail of your writings and says, you don't spell this word this way.
I'm hesitating very much on Rhys's book here, I got to say. Well, thank you, everyone. What a lovely discussion. Thanks to the panelists and to the audience for some really great questions that put them on the spot, I think. I like the idea of real books as interpretations of village notice boards. And also the danger, the jeopardy that can be entailed in writing them if real Port Talbot is anything to go by. And you know, a word of warning to the people of Yorkshire: keep your dogs away from Ian.
Yeah, definitely.
I think one of the things that really came out tonight was that one of the rewarding things for me as a publisher is that authors find out that they're on a voyage of discovery when they're writing these books, that they
Definitely
know that they find things that aren't true, like Rhys and Frankenstein, but they also find that there's so much to learn about the patch. So Rhys and John, no making it up, okay? And if anyone's got any ideas for a real book, get in touch, because it would be great if this evening was the source of new titles for the series.
There'll be hundreds arriving now, Mick.
I'm sorry?
You regret that. You regret that.
I don't think so. I really don't. Great. Thank you all very much. It's been a really splendid evening, and thanks for helping us celebrate 40 years of publishing at Seren.